Welcome to a bonus episode of Energy versus Climate. I'm your co-host, Ed Whittingham, and today we have a special guest well known to EVC listeners because she is none other than our very own Sara Hastings-Simon. Over the summer, Sara and I got chatting about some of her recent research, including into EV charging, and we thought to ourselves, why not share the findings of the research through a Q&A between the two of us? So here we are. And Sara, I'd say, welcome to Energy versus Climate, but it's your show, so that would be really weird.
Yeah, and I would say, I don't know. I'm glad to be here. We could do the usual podcast intro exchange.
That's right. I think we've covered it. So let's just dive right in and with the basics. I mentioned that this is your research that you and others have conducted into EV charging, and so we're going to talk about level 1, level 2, and even level 3 EV charging. Can you, off the top, explain that for listeners?
Definitely. So the different levels refer to charging speeds. And as I'll explain in a minute, there's a little bit of fuzziness sort of in the middle there, but at the two ends, it's very clear. So level 1 is EV charging with what you think of as sort of a regular plug, a socket that you might plug your toaster into. So that's 120 volts. So you can get about just over a kilowatt of power out of that. Level 3, which is also sometimes called direct current fast charging or fast charging, supercharging. Those are those big stations you see, on the side of a highway. Those have charging rates of, upwards of 50 kilowatts and above. Not something you would ever really install in your home. Not even, often they're not even in like, say, a shopping mall center or something like that. In between those sits this wide range of level 2, and that really ranges anywhere from 5 to 20 kilowatts. So the charging happens at 240 volts. So again, if we're going back to what we know in the home, that looks like a dryer plug that you can plug something into. And that can either be a fixed charger, or you can just have kind of a cable with a plug on either end. And to give a few kind of numbers out there. So what do I mean when I say, 5 to 20 kilowatts? If you think about a electric dryer in your home that you might use to dry your clothes, that's going to draw about 5 kilowatts. So it's that, that 5 kilowatt is pretty much, unless you have a heat pump or something, probably the largest thing that you have in your home, even if you do actually, as long as you don't have a heat pump with backup heating. And it can go up, even higher than that, kind of to 20, down at that 1.4 kilowatts. That's really kind of in the noise of other things that you might be doing at home and doesn't stand out.
Yeah, and because it will come up, are most homes, we'll limit it to Alberta where we are most homes, do they come wired with 240 volts? Volt outlets?
So typically you'll have, probably one, say, in the laundry room. Newer homes might have them in the garage if people are thinking about EV chargers, but otherwise you wouldn't have had one necessarily installed in the garage.
Yeah. By example, the house that I have here in Canmore, it's got a 240 volt outlet down in the garage, which we use. My wife Yuka uses to fire her kiln when she fires her pottery. Now, let's talk about practical applications. But I guess before we do that, let's back up. Who did you do the research with, and what question did you set out to answer through the research?
Sure. So this is some work I did with Blake Schaefer, who's also a professor at the University of Calgary and a two-time Energy versus Climate guest, and Aviv Fried, who is working with us as a research associate also at the University of Calgary, but is probably better known as the founder and head baker at Sidewalk Citizen Bakery here in Calgary.
That's quite the team to conduct the research. Yeah, what question did you set out to answer through it?
Sure. So our overall research question was, one way to put it is, who is right, Sara or Blake? But the more formal version of the research question was, is level 1 charging sufficient to meet electric vehicle drivers' needs? So basically, if you, Ed, or somebody else is going to go purchase an electric vehicle, do you really need to install a level 2 charger in your home, or can you get by with just, what's probably in your garage already or already, at the side of your house, say if you don't have a garage, but you have a driveway in front. We thought this was an interesting question to answer because if you look around at sort of the way that people talk about EVs, there's somewhat of an implicit assumption that you need to have a level 2 charger in order to, operate an EV sort of conveniently in your home.
So I want to probe on that a little bit. Is there evidence of doubt in the market among new or prospective EV owners that access to only level 1 charging is suppressing EV sales, and you wanted to test the validity of that doubt, i.e., I don't have a 240 volt outlet in my garage, and therefore I can't get an EV?
The short answer to that is we don't have sort of firm evidence of that. We motivated this question, as I said, of, is level 1 charging sufficient by basically pointing out that in many cases, when you look in sort of the popular media and other places, you find this like kind of implicit, like, oh, you're getting an EV, therefore you need to get a level 2 charger. I was joking about, is Blake or Sara right? The two of us had made different choices about what chargers to put in our own homes. So I think that's an interesting question that one could approach with a different research study, right? Which would be a sort of like a survey-based study of how much does your imagined need for level 1 charging or level 2 charging, prevent you from getting an EV. For our purposes, we just sort of said, we think this is out there and we're really going to try to look at, is it possible to do this for a substantial portion of the population with level 1?
So let's go to the results. You show that a material number of EV owners, and it's close to 30%, can meet all their charging needs just through level 1 charging. And is this finding, just that one, and we can talk about other findings, but was that finding surprising to you, or did it confirm your and your colleagues' hypothesis going in?
So I think we knew that there was going to be some percentage of vehicles that could have their energy needs met with level 1. We didn't really have a good sense of, is it going to be 5% or 30% or 50%. So I think it was a little bit surprising that it was as large as 30% across a sample of all drivers with all different types of patterns.
Sure, and remind us what was your sample size?
Sure. So we had real world driving and charging data for 129 battery electric vehicles operating in Calgary over the period of 13 months. So this takes into account, the Calgary winters and potential loss of range. And those drivers had a range of driving patterns. Obviously, they were EV drivers already because they were driving EVs, but their sort of average mileage across the data sample matches pretty well to the average Alberta mileage. So, the sample size and kind of the study itself, I would say that the findings shouldn't be interpreted as, okay, this is, exactly the number of drivers that can use level 1 charging. It's much more of a, is there a there when we think about a role for level 1 charging, or is kind of coming out of the paper, I think we've come to appreciate more the potential for something that you might call, level 1 plus or low power level 2, this kind of, maybe you want a little bit more than 1.4, but you don't quite need, 5 kilowatts. And that has real implications for homes, for the panels, as well as the broader distribution grid.
And so 30% of respondents said they can fully meet their energy needs just with level 1 charging. But you've got a mixture of others who are doing a combination of level 1 charging, and then also, it sounds like, some level 3 charging as well. Do you have a sense of why someone, say, would most of the time charge level 1, but then sometimes they'd be out charging level 3? Is it just because they're on the road and that's the only charging they have access to?
Yeah, so I'll take a step back and just explain sort of what we did in the study. So we took real world driving and charging data from EV owners, many of whom do have level 2 chargers as part of their, they have it because they got one when they got an EV. And so what we did was we took their real actual charging and driving data, and then we ran a sort of modeling exercise where we said, basically, if we took away your level 2 charger, we didn't do this in real life, but we modeled out if we took away their level 2 charger and we basically replaced it with a level 1 charger and we had them plug in their vehicle, when they went home, would they be able to meet their energy needs based on the amount of time that would be plugged in? We set aside the kind of road trip part where they were charging with level 3 because we assume that's outside the home. So we found that there was this, 29%, almost 30% of people that basically only ever need level 1. They're fine. They just plug in and get that slower charge. Then for the set of people for whom basically in our model, they ran into a point where, we've run out of power. I haven't been able to charge as much as I need for my next trip. We gave them a sort of modeled level 3 supplementary charge. And the reason that we did that is that one way you could imagine to integrate level 1 charging, and part of the reason that, when I bought an EV, I decided not to put a level 2 charger in our home, was that you could, it's practical to think about people using a level 3 charger somewhere in their neighborhood or nearby as a supplement. So you might be in that, in that 30% that can get by with a level 1 charger, but it might be a little worrying, right? And so you would have the ability to essentially, top up at a level 3 charger, not on a road trip, but just, sort of neighborhood on those rare times that you needed it. And so that allowed us to further segment this group where we say basically 30%, almost 30% can use just level 1 charging. And then another on top of that, 53% can use this combination of basically level 1 charging, and then occasionally they would have to go and get a level 3 charge depending on their driving patterns.
So I conducted my own very thorough broad-based survey of EV owners with an N of 3. And I did that in the hour before we started taping this. And what I found was unanimous agreement with your results and some interesting stats. So Jason Switzer, we know of the Pipelines and Turbines podcast, says he really only uses level 3 during trips. Level 1, which he can charge at 9 kilometers an hour of recharge, is plenty. And, I heard this stat, most EV drivers are only driving about 30 kilometers a day. They're not driving very much. Justin Fish, a friend and renewables lawyer who lives here in Canmore, talked about his Bolt. And his Bolt takes 48 hours to charge 350 kilometers. So 12 of those hours, if he's just charging level 1 overnight, gets him, say, the 80 kilometers that he needs to get to where he needs to go between Canmore and even into Calgary one way. But the question is, what do you tell owners now? Because there's a whole, and I'll give a shout out to Marlo Reynolds, about level 2. So it's not a barrier. However, there's this major convenience factor to having level 2 at home. And in fact, Marla Reynolds, who is leading a startup, former chief of staff to 2 federal environment ministers, and is leading a startup called Charger Ready that's looking at charging infrastructure. He had this great analogy. He said, most people can live fine with a beer fridge-sized refrigerator, but having a full-sized fridge for your beer is just damn convenient. So I'm going to stop there and just love to get your comments on those anecdotes, Sarah.
Well, lots of thoughts there. Maybe I'll start with the last one and work my way backwards. I think the beer fridge is a great analogy in terms of, and this doesn't just apply to, EV charging in the home, but on a lot of topics, frankly, we talk about on EVC, which is like, how do we right size our equipment for what you need? And often the really expensive part of building out any system, whether it's EV charging or, beer storage, is about those edge cases. So those times where you're going to be traveling a lot in 1 week, or those times when you have, a bunch of people over for a party. And there's different ways to approach that, but certainly building out a system that kind of is always able to provide that edge case is, generally going to be the most expensive and highest energy demand way of doing so. So what does that mean when it comes to charging? Certainly there are people for whom, they're really driving quite a bit in a year. And that translates to a lot in a day. And frankly, they're going to have a hard time. There was one driver in this sample that we had that drove, over 90,000 kilometers a year. I don't know if it was like an Uber driver or something, but obviously they're going to have a hard time, meeting their charging needs without a level 2 charger. For those that are not driving as far, though, as you said, I think in general, we tend to actually overestimate how much we drive on a daily basis. A lot of vehicles are actually able to kind of meet that average daily mileage energy requirements with that level 1. And the sort of edge case, then one way to deal with that is to have access to, in your beer analogy, it would be like a communal beer fridge that you can go and, borrow or store your beer in for those couple of times. So why might you want to do that? Sure, it's definitely less convenient, right? I mean, if you have it in your home, whether it's a charger or the fridge, it's, definitely going to be easier to do. But it's really a question then of like cost versus convenience trade-off. And we can talk more about that, but those faster chargers, they certainly can come at a cost to the individual homeowner, whether that's just the cost of the charger itself, the cost of potentially having to upgrade your panel or, upgrade the service to your panel. And then, of course, there's also a cost on the grid side. The other thing is that came out of this research for me is really this idea of like, well, if 1.4 kilowatts isn't quite enough, if the level 1 charging isn't quite enough, maybe we should be encouraging people to put in level 2 chargers that are, just double that, just the 2.8 kilowatts. Electrically, that's actually simpler to do. So I'm told. I'm not an electrician, so ask your electrician. This is not official advice, but that might be sort of a sweet spot that gives you enough of that flexibility, but doesn't start to require infrastructure upgrades in the same way. And coming back to your N of 3 as a study reviewer, I would say I feel like you need a slightly bigger sample size. But I do think it is a good reminder for folks that, might be thinking, could this work for me? Or I wanted to get an EV, but like, there's no way I can upgrade my panel in my home, to realize, hey, this might actually be an option and might be something I should at least look into if it could work for me.
Yeah, well, I personally think my N of 3 is very scientifically valid, and especially it's amazing what you can do by text with an hour before recording. I will say, by the way, the beer analogy, the keen EVC listener will remember that we regularly use beers as analogies to make points, as we did with our carbon offset show. And sometimes we produce beers or work with breweries to produce beers. And I'll just say, watch this space. We'll leave it at that as a little teaser. But coming back to level 1, level 2, and then I want to draw out implications for current or potential EV owners. And then, as we always do, talk about grid managers and policymakers. Tell us, is there a time of day advantage available in Canada, in Alberta? For instance, there's actually an advantage, and it might, that time of day, maybe it doesn't get you over the hurdle to upgrade your panel, because that's a few $1,000, but you're not upgrading your panel, you're just putting in a 240 volt. If I charge at a certain limited time per day, I'm incentivized by my utility to do that, versus running all day when, crossing over that all day, you're going to be buying electricity at the most expensive times.
Yeah, so you hit exactly on sort of one of the trade-offs, obviously, from the distribution grid, so the kind of local wires, the transformer that sits by your home and the panel in your home. It's better to smooth out that demand and charge at lower levels. From a grid perspective, there may well be times, like the middle of a sunny day in Alberta, when there's a lot of excess power available at relatively low cost, and you would actually want to have faster chargers so that you can shift more of your demand there. And so there is, with this level 1 charging, as with many things in energy transition, there is a trade-off, right? So one shouldn't overinterpret these results to say, well, we should never let people do level 2 charging. Level 2 charging is always bad. No, it's really more saying there may be some cases where level 1 charging makes more sense, but we should look at the trade-offs between being able to have less of that, local infrastructure needs versus giving up the ability to do some of that time shifting to, say, middle of the day. And so I think, this is actually some work that we're trying to look at now. I think it's also going to depend very much on the details of where you are, but there may be some cases where, level 1 makes sense or more sense, or level 2. The other thing that we didn't really emphasize in the paper, but I think is also valid, is that you think about something like a workplace, and there's often a lot of focus on retrofitting level 2 chargers in the workplace. And maybe in some cases, it might make sense to, rather than having a few level 2 chargers, to actually put level 1 charging at all the stalls. And so my favorite example of, where that would make a lot of sense, or the dumbest place that you can possibly install a level 2 charger, is the long-term parking lot at the airport, where by definition, everybody is spending at least, 48 hours there, enough time that any EV can charge fully with level 1. And And yet, rather than putting level 1 at a bunch of spots, they have a few number of spots with level 2. So what we're sort of trying to do with this research and the results is not say, level 2 charging is bad and we shouldn't do it, but rather, hey, maybe we should be a little more thoughtful about where level 1 makes sense. And also, if people don't have the ability to do level 2, they might consider if they can still have an EV work for them.
Yeah, and it's an interesting challenge for policymakers. Anything to do with electricity is a challenge for policymakers, because on one hand, with people using level 1 instead of level 2, correct me if I'm wrong, it could lessen loads per household compared to level 2 charging, because you're spreading out that charging over longer periods. But if we have that, brings more EV owners into the market, more people buying EVs, and they're coming home and they're charging at the same time when they get home, then you're increasing overall neighborhood loads on an absolute basis, and that creates the same problem.
Yeah, and that gets to some work actually that I think just recently came out that Blake Schaefer did with some other colleagues, looking at kind of how you manage these potential spikes in demand and the importance of really starting to think more about ways to spread out that demand, particularly if people are installing very fast level 2 chargers, right? And that comes back again to the first point, which is it makes it that much harder if you're asking distribution utility operators to integrate level 2 chargers, that might be 6, 8, 10 kilowatts. That's really a lot more than the size of equipment that they're sort of historically have had to deal with. And so, certainly I think whether it's level 1 or level 2, certainly it does seem to make sense to incentivize or encourage people not to put in really, as my kids would say, overpowered OP level 2 chargers.
Yes, as they would say. So what does this all mean, if you boil it down to a potential EV owner like myself? And I'm someone, I surf the back of the wave. I'm the opposite of an early adopter typically. One of those households, we know our next vehicle, whether new or used, will be an EV. And, I'm mulling my big decision. And Sara, I'm going to use my Bitcoin proceeds, from that strategic investment I made before a crypto versus climate episode, because I'm in the money now from that investment. You could have got in while the going was good, but you poo-pooed it. And now I'm in the money. So I'm going to plug that into, pardon the pun, my EV purchase. So what should I take from this? And as someone who already has infrastructure for a level 2 charging, fortunately in his garage, I just have to, tell Yuka not to fire her kiln on certain days.
So, I think a couple of things, certainly as someone who has the ability to install a level 2, there's, there may still be some cost that comes with it. Although I think some of the newer EVs are actually just coming with the cables you can plug directly in. So, I think if you want to be a good grid citizen, you should take a serious look at your driving needs and think before you put in a very high powered level 2 charger. Is this really something that I need, or can I get by with a bit less? If you didn't already have that 240 volt in your garage, I would say definitely look at your driving habits and maybe even decide to sort of get an EV and see how it goes, with the plan to use the level 3 if you need to supplement that before you go ahead and get a level 2. Or if you really want an EV and you don't have the ability to put a level 2 charger, don't despair, don't completely give up. See if level 1 is an option, and if you have some level 3 charging available near you. I think it's the one thing that's challenging about this is that it's really giving or sort of asking people to kind of process even more information when they're thinking about purchasing an EV. So I do think that there is a role in here for more education in terms of, whether that's the EV dealers or potentially utilities coming in and saying, hey, there's, a role for this lower powered charging. Certainly also managed charging is another piece of that as well, too. So some policy elements that still need to come in there as well. But at a high level, I'd say, if you're an EV interested person, don't let the inability to install level 2 prevent you from moving forward, and think seriously before you get a really high powered one, or before you spend, any chunk of money on putting one in, if it's something that you really need.
And I'd add to that, and I'll tell a quick story. Don't let the assumption that it's a small town and therefore won't have, say, level 2 or higher charging infrastructure get in the way. And I say that because Marlo, who I'd mentioned as part of the N of 3, one of the N of 3, we went and we paddled the upper Red Deer River, this great class of whitewater in Alberta in early July. He's got a new Rivian truck, an EV truck. And we're looking at it. It's got about 500 kilometers of range, but we realized we need to do a little bit of top up. I'm using the universal we. Marla did all the calculating. Called and found in Sundre, Alberta, that there is a Dairy Queen with a Tesla charger in the back parking lot because the Dairy Queen owner is a Tesla owner, installed it, and said, come by and use it. Just come in and buy some blizzards, which is exactly what we did after a successful paddle and that little top up. We thought it probably wasn't necessary, but it just gave us the peace of mind, and it led to delicious blizzards after a paddle. So there you go. It's out there. It's happening, folks. And Sara, thanks for this. It's nice to really look at EVs really from the perspective of home-based charging, which we haven't done on EVC before. This is the time when I'd thank you as a guest for coming on the show. But again, it's your show, so that would just be even weirder.
So then I will not thank you for having me, but I'll say it was fun to chat about this, and it's always fun to talk about the research that you've been doing, especially when you get to the chance to work with the great research associates like Aviv, who was doing all that. As you said, in the we did this, it's often they are the ones who are the we of actually doing that modeling and that calculation. So big thanks to Aviv.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emma Tanton, with help from Crystal Hickey. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President Research and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. With this show obviously being the exception, Sara's out of commission for the time being due to her recent breast cancer diagnosis. We look forward to having her back on EBC as soon as she's able to be back. In the meantime, David and I will be back with a special live taping of Energy versus Climate that we made at the Energy Disruptors Conference in Calgary. We'll see you then.